To getting back to really looking forward to getting back to being in each other's presence, but Zoom does have its benefits. So I'm calling this presentation such a shame because we're going to focus in on shame. I remember being a little girl. I think I was in second grade, and I accidentally gave away the answer of a test in front of the whole class. And the teacher, who everybody loved, and normally I did too, turned to me and scolded me loudly and censoriously in front of the entire class. And I remember that crushing sense of shame as a little girl who had been shamed publicly. Such a crushing thing. We all have an experience like that that I think we can relate to. But what I want to do in order to understand shame is I want to go back to the Garden of Eden. And I want to look at the moment that I believe shame came into human experience. You see, Adam and Eve were created in such a way that they were not ashamed. We're told that they were naked, but not ashamed, and that they had no shame in their experience. Shame in human experience is directly related to the sin problem. When sin came into human experience, so did shame. And the way it went was this: God said not to eat of this particular tree in the garden. It was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they could eat from any other tree. Well, Eve found herself near that tree, dialoguing with the serpent, and the serpent was the devil sort of disguised. And as a result, he tricked her into consuming the fruit of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. As a result of that, Adam and Eve, and Eve quickly went to her husband and gave him the fruit. And as a result of that, humanity descended into a sinful condition. This is the very first thing that happens when humanity finds itself in a sinful condition. The very first thing is the eyes of them both were opened and they knew that they were naked. Now, back to when I was a little girl, I had a recurring dream as a little girl that I would show up at school. I would take off my coat, and all that I would have on under my coat was my undershirt and my underpants. That's it. And you know how weird dreams are. In this particular dream, I couldn't, for some reason, put my coat back on and run home and get dressed. I just was a kid that forgot to put my clothes on in the morning, showed up at school, and there was nothing I could do about it. I had to stand there in my underwear. What a humiliating feeling. But the scriptures use the term nakedness to describe shame because we feel embarrassed when we are naked. And embarrassment is a type of shame. So it's using the term naked somewhat figuratively to describe the overwhelming shame that Adam and Eve felt as a result of falling into sin. And so shame is pervasive and foundational to human experience. And I want to emphasize that it is something that all of us deal with on some level or another, whether we're fully aware of it or not. It's extremely pervasive and it's very, very baseline and essential to our experience as human beings as the result of what happened here in Genesis 3, recorded in Genesis 3. So here's one sociologist slash psychologist. He's saying that coping with shame is a daily preoccupation, not shame in the big toxic sense, but in a kind of everyday way. As he's talking about this pervasive, constant, chronic sense of shame that we as human beings have. This is another psychologist. He says shame is the most disturbing experience individuals ever have about themselves. No other emotion feels more deeply disturbing because in the moment of shame, the self feels wounded from within. It's almost like this rotten core. We have a sense of like something so deep down that it's just at our very center. And you're going to see why that is so in a few moments here. But I want to talk for a minute about how shame can lead us into very damaging cycles. So look down at the bottom here. We experience shame as human beings. And a lot of times what we do to try to cope with that shame is we end up engaging in escapist behaviors, addictions, sinful habits, things that ultimately damage us and other people. And that can ultimately lead to addiction, where we're so deep into these habits that we end up being unable to escape them. I mean, basically, the definition of addiction is that you're so attached to a practice or something that you're powerless over that thing. And indeed, the 12-step ministries always bring people to the place, first and foremost, where they admit that they are powerless over their addiction. So often the sin leads to addiction, or at least to what we might call process addictions or very bad habits. And that can bring a lot of damage to us. And that damage brings pain. And then as we feel that pain, oftentimes that it sort of, activates a sense of shame, and the cycle goes around and around and around. God can break the cycle, but I want to create a little tension in my talk here and not resolve this issue too soon. This is from the book 13 Weeks to Joy. I have a copy of it right here. I don't know if you guys can see me. I'm going to stop share for a second. This is a book that I wrote. I think it's probably backwards on the screen. Maybe it isn't. I'm not sure. But I have 3 books that are laid out like workbooks. The first is 13 Weeks to Peace. The second is 13 Weeks to Love. And this one is 13 Weeks to Joy. And this is about cultivating positive emotions. And I have a chapter in here on shame that I'm basing my talk tonight on. So I'm going to quote something from that book tonight and share it with you. Just a moment. Shame drives relationship dysfunction in both its aggressive narcissistic form, characterized by compensatory pride, and its compliant codependent form, characterized by low self-esteem. So if you think back to the Garden of Eden, you remember that Adam and Eve were, getting along reasonably well, and then they experienced this fall into sin, and then they're basically at each other's throats. And so relationship problems tend to come on the tail of shame. So what I'm saying here is that shame can drive that relationship dysfunction. And there are a couple different forms. There's an aggressive narcissistic form where one person feels very prideful. And then there's another form where people feel very compliant, very filled with low self-esteem, and then oftentimes codependent on other people. So there's kind of passive and aggressive forms of shame. Shame keeps us from opening up to love because we're unworthy. At the same time, it makes us overly dependent upon human approval to anesthetize away the pain of our self-disapproval. Then it makes us critical toward those who fail to deliver. We're mad at people because they don't give us that approval that we need, and we're so dependent on that human approval because we don't even approve of ourselves. Shame drives blame of others because how can I take responsibility when I'm so bad that I can't do anything right? That's what shame is basically saying. Let's talk about this a little bit more and how shame is related to self-justification. You remember the story. It says the eyes of them both were open. They knew that they were naked. And for those of you that aren't acquainted with the story in Genesis chapter 3, we're told that immediately afterward, Adam and Eve made fig leaf garments. You can see that Adam has a little fig leaf Speedo and Eve has a little fig leaf bikini. And this happened, they did this as a result of that overwhelming feeling of shame. So the very first thing they did after experiencing shame is they tried to compensate for that shame. And those fig leaves symbolize self-justification. So they try to fix themselves, basically, is what they're doing here. Oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling so ashamed. Oh, and then they try to do something to assuage that sense of shame. Now, as I see it, we're all prone to not just shame, but also self-justification. But again, there are 2 forms of this. One is the entitled form. Oh, I'm all that, and I feel justified within myself. Then there's another form, and these individuals will be more inclined to feel unworthy, not good enough, and needing to somehow do something to make themselves worthy. These 2 conditions really operate from the same foundation, and that is the belief that there is something that I can do to make myself worthy in the sight of God. And that isn't true. It's a false belief. And when we operate from that false belief, we can go to one extreme or the other, but it's still the same foundational misbelief. So out of that experience of trying to make ourselves worthy, we discover something in behavioral science called licensing effect. So let me talk about this for a moment. This is a person that has studied licensing effects. She says past good deeds can liberate individuals to engage in behaviors that are immoral, unethical, or otherwise problematic. And I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of examples of these. But look at what she's saying. She's saying when people do something good, they can then start to feel entitled or licensed to do something immoral, unethical, or otherwise problematic. Do you see what's going on here? Is if a person feels that there is something that they can do to make themselves worthy, then they're going to work kind of on that basis of scales. Like if I do enough good things, I'm going to tip the scales in the direction of me being good enough. And I can slip in a few immoral or unethical practices. This licensing effect is very well established in behavioral science. Okay, so this is an example. There was a study done in which individuals who endorsed Barack Obama during the 2008 presidential election were more likely to express racist views in other contexts. That might be licensing effect. Here's another one. Moral outrage is a big source of, or something that sort of couples with licensing effect. So in this study, the author noted that Americans, on hearing reports of dire working conditions at facilities in China where iPhones were manufactured, continued to buy Apple products. So people are all up in arms. These terrible things are happening, but they continue to engage in the behavior. He says this failure to follow through on the conviction stems from the need to transfer the blame onto some other harm doer to find a bigger, badder boogeyman in order to vindicate ourselves. All right, so that's a lot of kind of complex, deep stuff, but let's get a little more practical here and talk about types of shame that we see. You know, I think that all of them stem back to the basic moral shame that we experience as a result of our sinful fallen condition. And out of that moral shame is sort of which is sort of the water table. You have all of these little sort of ancillaries. So I think the answer to shame is in resolving the moral shame that we have. And I think while that moral shame is unresolved, we're going to be more inclined toward these types of shame. So body shame, it's a big one for women. And I understand this is a women's event. I think it's just toxic how we constantly behold on our screens these days the images of photoshopped and perfect and beautiful and, exemplary, physically speaking, women. And then the other thing that we see a lot of in terms of imagery, I don't know if you guys know this, but media is done in such a way that it has to connect very quickly because all the medias are are after one thing, and that is our attention. So media is very driven by messages that gives messages that engage the brain very quickly. Well, the lower part of the brain engages quickly. The higher part, the reasoning, conscious, spiritual part of the brain does not engage quickly at all. It's the slower part of the brain. So in order to quickly engage people, we have to appeal to lower brain messages. And they fall into basically three categories: sex, food, and violence. Those are the things that grab your attention. And so that's why we see so much violence and so much sex in media, because it does grab attention. So as part of that, women's bodies are projected in front of us all the time, and they're often very sexy looking and very sexualized. But then guess what else gets projected? Food. So women are told to be this perfect body, but then they're given these images of food. So there's a very confusing mixture of messages being given to us. Oh, you need to eat this. This, you can't live without this, but you need to look like her. Um, it's not going to work out very well. So women are the special victims of body shame. Women develop far more eating disorders, far more body dysmorphia, which is where a person's sense of their unattractiveness is just way disproportionate to how unattractive they actually are. In fact, many very beautiful people, especially women, develop body dysmorphia where they are genuinely overwhelmed with shame at the way they look, and they're strikingly beautiful. It's very, very, very sad. So there are these types of things that especially affect women under the general heading of body shame. And there's behavior shame. We do something wrong, we feel a sense of shame about it. There's mind shame. Maybe you don't feel intelligent. Maybe you have difficulty with technology. Now, you guys are pretty young, many of you, but people in my generation, I was on the phone with someone a week or and a half ago weeping because they couldn't figure out technology and they felt so dumb. So that feeling of being less intelligent, I would call mind shame. Material shame is when we don't have the things that other people have. Religious shame, we've all experienced this, or maybe some of us have, where we aren't as religious or as holy somehow as other people. Then there's a sense of collective shame where we all experience shame at the same time. And I think when we hear about a shameful act of a human being, there's kind of this collective shame that comes into a community. Oh, that's so terrible that he did that. And people almost blush and look down at the ground. Social shame is shame feeling unaccepted or unworthy socially. So those are all the different sort of branches, the different directions that shame can run in. But what we want to know is how to resolve that core of shame so that these things don't tempt us and pull on us so much. So let's look at a little bit into how guilt and shame relate. Guilt says I did wrong. Shame says I am wrong. Guilt says sinners sin. Shame says sin is unique to me. So guilt has a more sort of um, practical attitude. Yeah, people sin. I sin, you sin, we sin. Shame feels more individualized when it comes to sin. This is something I do and I'm ashamed of it. And we tend to engage in what I call singling, where we single ourselves out when we are feeling ashamed. Guilt says I fail sometimes. Shame says if I fail, I am a failure. Guilt says there is forgiveness. Shame says this is permanent. Guilt says this is about them. Shame says this is about me. Guilt says, how did you feel? And shame says, how do I feel? So what happens with guilt is we can actually resolve it because there's something we can do about it. We can admit we did wrong, we can confess, and we can ask for forgiveness. But shame says, this is in me. It is stuck to me. It's not just a thing that I did that's external to me, but it is something that is at my core. And so shame in many ways can be much more devastating than guilt. That's very interesting. Some research was done on guilt proneness versus shame proneness in individuals. And they said that guilt proneness involves a working model of self that is humble about personal limitations. You know, person says, I do things wrong sometimes. Shame proneness involves a more narcissistic working model of self. In other words, more thinking this is about me. Some of the effects of shame are things like low self-esteem, feelings of hostility. These are all things that have been validated in science, by the way. Social anxiety has been correlated with shame, depression, eating disorders, body dysmorphia again. I want to go forward here for a second and put a wrench in the works because it'd be very easy at this point to say, well, it's okay to have guilt, but we shouldn't have shame. But I want to say this to you. I think shame has a place. And I think that it's true that we are wrong. There's something very deeply broken about us morally. But the main reason I want to leave a little bit of room for shame in human experience is because completely disallowing shame creates secondary disturbance. What do I mean by secondary disturbance? Secondary disturbance is when you're disturbed and then you're disturbed about being disturbed. So you feel ashamed and then you feel ashamed of the fact that you feel ashamed because I'm supposed to not feel ashamed. So I'm not going to create that situation for you where as soon as you have feelings of shame, you feel ashamed of it because I think that could compound the problem. I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that human beings are broken, that we are fallen, and that we are morally altered in such a way that shame has its place. I don't think it's about whether we have shame or not. I think it's about what we do with it when we have it. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But this is very interesting. Study was done on some prison inmates. They found that the shame prone were more likely to reoffend for whatever their crime was. The shame prone were more likely to blame others, but the shame prone that did not blame others were no less likely to reoffend than the guilt prone inmates. So it's in this research, it appears that there are some kinds of shame that are unhealthy and maybe some kinds that are more healthy. the researchers said the possibility that shame could be harnessed for social good is tantalizing. So the question that I wanted to ask is, what do we do with shame? How does God break into this profound cycle that I talked about at the beginning of the talk? This cycle where one thing leads to another over and over again. I think what God does is he transforms our shame into repentance. Let's look at this passage for a moment here. Do you despise the riches of his goodness, forbearance, and long suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? Let's talk about that for just a moment. You know, there's a lot of shaming going on, and all you have to do is look at social media. There's so much shame on social media. You've heard of cancel culture and this type of thing. People's lives being ruined because of one mistake. There's just this mass that the internet and social media have created the potential for way beyond the amount of mass shame that we used to experience. So it's really quite frightening what can happen to an individual in the blink of an eye because they make a stupid mistake or a sinful mistake even. So there's an interesting statement I read once that said, "No one is ever won by censure and reproach, but many are thus led to steel their hearts against conviction." In other words, harden their hearts against conviction. So when we're dealing with the sinfulness of human beings, if we shame those individuals, we're going to make it less likely that they actually correct the things that we're shaming them for. That's a fact of human behavior. Thank God that he doesn't treat us that way. But the goodness of God leads us to repentance. The fact that he holds out to us his forgiveness. He says, look, I have a very realistic view of you. You are a sinner. You are fallen, and you will do things wrong. But I hold out to you the potential of receiving my grace and forgiveness and starting again. That is the goodness of God. And that leads us to a place where we are not frightened to admit that we are wrong, because when we're being shamed, we will harden ourselves against vulnerability, because if we make ourselves vulnerable in the midst of being shamed, it's going to hurt even more. So people harden in a shame context. But what God does is he takes the shame away and he invites us to believe in his forgiveness and grace. And it is there that we can find the courage to say, I did wrong and I am wrong and I need you, Jesus. So to go on here with this text, beautiful passage. In accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to everyone according to his deeds. Very, very heavy statement. But remember, it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. And that is what provides the turning point in our experience that enables us to move from shame and over again doing the same thing in these broken cycles that we get ourselves into, and actually experiencing a new life in Jesus Christ. I want to go back to this passage here. Can you guys see this? No, maybe I lost the screen. What did I do with that? Sorry. I just lost this for some reason. There we go. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come upon those who are treacherous without cause. So I want to encourage you guys. I know we all experience shame. I don't want you to feel like you're a freak when you experience it. It doesn't mean you're hopeless. It doesn't mean that you're flawed in a way that nobody else is flawed. What I want you to do is take that shame to Jesus and let him resolve it, and let him give you his forgiveness and grace and a new chance at life. So let's just have some discussion and like question and answers and just dialogue here. That was a pretty heavy talk. So I'm sure you're processing.